In May 1934, Reich Aviation Minister Hermann Göring signed the technical specification for a single-seat interceptor fighter to replace the outdated biplanes Heinkel 51 and Arado 68. The specification called for a single-engine all-metal aircraft with a maximum speed of no less than 400 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 4,000 meters. The document, marked top secret, was sent to 3 leading aircraft manufacturers: Ernst Heinkel, Focke-Wulf, and Arado. Each company received advance payment to build 3 prototypes, from which the best would later be chosen after testing. Interestingly, the company Bayerische Flugzeugwerk, owned by the future winner Willy Messerschmitt, did not receive the assignment. The young and still little-known designer was considered unfit for such a serious task. But the talented and ambitious engineer, learning of the requirements, decided to build a prototype at his own expense and enter the competition nonetheless. By the spring of 1935, the prototypes of the Arado AR-80 and the Focke-Wulf FW-159 were ready to fly. At Heinkel, however, burdened with other projects, work dragged on. Testing began without him. So, what did the contestants present? Both machines were powered by inline liquid-cooled engines. The AR-80 was a cantilever low-wing monoplane of fairly clean design with a trapezoidal gull wing. By contrast, its fixed landing gear, open cockpit, and fabric-covered tail section made it look rather old-fashioned. The Focke-Wulf design was more original. The FW-159 was a parasol high-wing monoplane with a closed cockpit and retractable landing gear. But that very gear became the Achilles heel of the aircraft. On its very first landing, it collapsed, and the aircraft was damaged beyond repair. The AR-80 outlasted its competitor by only a few days. At an early stage of testing, it too crashed and was not repaired. Both Focke-Wulf and Arado turned to building replacements. Still, the aviation ministry could already see that neither project held much promise. By the pace of aviation development, the AR-80's design was morally obsolete within just a year or two, making serial production pointless. The Focke-Wulf concept also seemed unpromising. Its struts and bracing created drag and prevented the aircraft from achieving high speeds. Meanwhile, by late summer, Heinkel had completed his machine. The prototype, designated He-112 V1, resembled a scaled-down Blitz. Smooth fuselage lines and elliptical wing and tail shapes gave the new fighter an elegant look. The only step backward was the open cockpit, added at the pilot's request. The aircraft first flew on 1 September 1935, piloted by Heinkel's chief test pilot Gerhard Nitschke. In October, the joint trials resumed, but now not with 2 or 3, but 4 prototypes. Willy Messerschmitt, to everyone's surprise, presented his own entry, the Bf-109 V1. There is little need to describe this machine. Everyone knows what the Me-109 became. From the outset, the main competition was between it and the Heinkel. The others quickly faded into the background. Messerschmitt had created an exceptionally successful aircraft, light and responsive, fast and very stable. It outperformed the He-112 in maximum speed and acceleration. However, the Heinkel, with its lower wing loading, was more maneuverable. It also had other advantages: better takeoff and landing performance, superior ground handling thanks to a wider landing gear track, and excellent visibility, hence Heinkel's insistence on an open cockpit. The climb rate of both aircraft was assessed as roughly equal. For a long time, the aviation ministry could not decide between the 2 prototypes. As a first step, both Messerschmitt and Heinkel were ordered to build 15 test aircraft for expanded military trials. The second He-112 prototype, V2, made its first flight in November. Its main difference was the engine. The V1 had been powered by a British Rolls-Royce Kestrel with 695 horsepower, while the V2 had a German Junkers Jumo 210 rated at 640 horsepower, which later became the standard engine for all fighter modifications. Incidentally, Messerschmitt was also required to make the same change. To compensate for reduced power and preserve speed characteristics, Heinkel slightly reduced the wing area and span. In February 1936, the second prototypes from Heinkel and Messerschmitt were delivered to the military testing ground at Rechlin. Their flight characteristics were closely evaluated by Germany's leading pilots, Major Robert Ritter von Gramm, test engineer Karl Franke, and World War I ace Colonel Ernst Udet, then inspector of Luftwaffe fighter aviation. The competition went almost evenly. Neither prototype demonstrated clear superiority, and pilot opinions split. Udet himself favored the Heinkel. His judgment carried great weight, but fate intervened. On 15 March, the He-112 crashed. It was quickly repaired, but a month later, a more serious accident forced its write-off. This proved fatal to the machine's prospects. Messerschmitt, meanwhile, successfully completed testing without incident. A new fighter was urgently needed and in large numbers, and the Bf-109 was not only superior in many ways, but also cheaper than the Heinkel, easier to produce and more convenient in service. As a result, in the summer of 1936, it was adopted by the Luftwaffe. Messerschmitt was awarded a contract for 76 production aircraft. Thus began the long and eventful history of Germany's most mass-produced combat aircraft. The setback during the spring trials did not yet put an end to this aircraft. It was decided to keep it as a reserve option in case, for some unforeseen reason, the Bf-109 program had to be abandoned. Heinkel retained the order for 15 Zero Series aircraft. The first of these essentially continued the line of prototypes, each incorporating new improvements from the designer. On the He-112 V3, the radiator tunnel was reshaped and armament was installed consisting of 2 synchronized machine guns mounted in the fuselage sides under the engine cowling. Later, the aircraft was equipped with a sliding canopy, but the design was deemed unsuccessful, and the next 3 examples once again had open cockpits. The He-112 V4 received an uprated Junkers Umo 210DA engine, whose power could briefly, for up to 5 minutes, be increased to 695 horsepower. In addition, the wing design was altered again, with a more curved leading edge and rounded tips. This prototype carried no machine guns. The V5 was nearly identical to the V4, but included armament. With this machine, Heinkel sought to enter the international market. In the spring of 1937, the aircraft was demonstrated to a Japanese naval delegation visiting Germany to examine promising new aircraft designs. The Japanese showed interest and decided to acquire the fighter for closer study. In March 1937, the V5 was shipped to Japan by sea. The next prototype, V6, was armed not with machine guns, but with a 20mm Rheinmetall Borsig MG C-30L autocannon, mounted between the cylinder blocks and firing through the hollow propeller shaft. The aircraft appeared in July 1936. Soon after, the German Aviation Ministry decided to use General Franco's uprising in Spain and the civil war that followed as a testing ground for new combat aircraft and tactics. According to this plan, in November 1936, 3 Bf-109 prototypes and the He-112 V6 were dispatched across the Pyrenees. By early December, all 4 machines had arrived at the Spanish port of Cadiz, from where they were transferred to the Tablada airfield near Seville. The aircraft were assigned to the 88th Fighter Squadron of the Condor Legion, composed of German volunteers and equipped with German aircraft. The Heinkel proved to be the only cannon-armed fighter, not only in the Legion, but in all of Franco's Air Force. For this reason, it was employed as a ground attack aircraft. Alongside Junkers Ju-87A dive bombers and Henschel HS-123s, it struck at Republican armored vehicles, field fortifications, and artillery positions. In early 1937, the Cannon Bird took part in battles on the Jarama River. On 16 March, during its most successful sortie, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Balthasar attacked an armored train at the Sassania station. On his third pass, Balthasar managed to hit an ammunition car, causing a massive explosion that destroyed the car and set off the shells on a neighboring flatbed. The train was completely annihilated. On his way back, the pilot used his remaining ammunition to disable a Republican tank. Following this, Balthasar was appointed commander of an experimental ground attack flight consisting of 3 two-seat Heinkel He-112 biplanes and the Cannonbird. In June, the flight fought on the Northern Front, supporting the nationalist advance on Bilbao. At the beginning of July, it was reassigned to the Central Front near Toledo. The He-112 was then flown by Unteroffizier Max Schulz, who in 10 days of combat reported the destruction of 3 Republican armored cars. The combat career of the Cannonbird ended on 19 July. While approaching to land, the engine suddenly seized. Schulz attempted to glide to the airfield, but as a glider, the Heinkel was far too heavy. The forced landing ended with the fuselage breaking in two. Remarkably, the pilot was unharmed, but the aircraft was written off. While the Bf-109 and He-112 were undergoing combat evaluation in Spain, series production of the Messerschmitt was accelerating. By the winter of 1936, the aviation ministry had firmly placed its bet on this machine, and Ernst Heinkel realized that his chances of overtaking the young rival had dwindled to almost nothing. Yet by then, he had already developed a project for a radically redesigned He-112. In fact, it was essentially a new aircraft, though it retained the old designation. The prototype He-112 V7 differed from its predecessors in virtually everything: wing, fuselage, tail, engine. The wingspan was reduced for the third time, becoming even shorter than the fuselage length, a bold and extraordinary solution for those years. No operational combat aircraft would feature such short wings until the advent of jets. The shapes of the fin and stabilizer were completely altered, and the rudder area was greatly enlarged. The hump behind the cockpit disappeared, and for the first time in world practice, the cockpit was enclosed by a clear teardrop canopy with all-round visibility. The only features retained were the oval wing planform and the gull wing scheme, though, in the V7, the wing outline was brought close to a pure ellipse.
The aircraft was fitted with the new Daimler-Benz DB600A engine, rated at 950 horsepower, which enabled it to achieve high speeds. However, these engines were also needed for He-111 bombers, whose production program was a top priority. Heinkel was made to understand that his fighters would not receive such engines. As a result, he was forced to return to the underpowered Jumo 210. Still, one more prototype, the V8, managed to fly with the Daimler-Benz, built to the earlier V4 to V6 configuration. An interesting chapter in the He-112's history was the participation of several prototypes and rocket experiments conducted by Professor Werner von Braun. In 1936, von Braun approached Ernst Heinkel with a request for an aircraft to serve as a flying testbed for an experimental liquid fuel rocket engine. The choice fell on the He-112 V3. Early the next year, the aircraft was fitted with a Walter rocket engine, along with tanks for fuel, methanol, and oxidizer, liquid oxygen. The piston engine was retained. Takeoffs and landings were to be performed with the piston engine, with the rocket motor ignited only in flight. The modification did not take long, and in early March, ground tests of the rocket engine were attempted. At its very first run, it exploded. The aircraft was blown to pieces over several hundred meters. Fortunately, the test team, anticipating such an outcome, had taken cover. The failure did not dishearten the scientist, and he persuaded Heinkel to provide him with a second aircraft, the He-112 V8. Once fitted with a rocket engine, the prototype received the additional designation U.
Installing the rocket motor in the tail cone required moving the tail wheel 1 meter forward, while the stabilizer was reinforced with extra struts. Ground tests were successful. In April 1937, test pilot Erich Vorsitz at the Peenemünde Proving Grounds made the first flight of the rocket piston fighter. Climbing to 800 meters, he shut down the Daimler-Benz engine and pressed the ignition button for the Walter rocket motor. Later, the pilot admitted that he did so with his heart in his throat, but there was no explosion. A 3-meter tongue of flame shot from the tail, and the machine rapidly accelerated. In just 13 seconds, the speed increased from 400 to 460 kilometers per hour. It was a success. The rocket engine had proven its viability. Just a few years later, an advanced version of the same motor would power the famous Me-163 fighter. Subsequent flights followed, one of which gave Vorsitz a great deal of gray hair. After the rocket motor had burned for its allotted seconds, he attempted to shut it down. Despite all his efforts, the Walter kept running. The mortal danger was that the motor could explode at any moment from overheating. Vorsitz even began loosening his harness to attempt a parachute jump, but then the engine shut off on its own, simply running out of fuel. The landing was relatively successful, though in his anxiety the pilot forgot to extend the landing gear. Within 2 months, the aircraft was repaired, the rocket control system refined, and tests resumed. Despite his earlier fright, Erich Vorsitz continued as the pilot. On 27 August, he achieved the first takeoff and circuit of the airfield powered solely by the rocket engine, without engaging the piston motor at all. In the autumn, another prototype, the He-112A03, joined the trials. Flights of fighters with combined propulsion gave Heinkel and von Braun valuable information for developing the experimental rocket aircraft He-176. At the end of 1937, the 8th He-112 prototype was returned to its original form. The rocket motor and its supporting systems were removed, and the tailwheel was restored to its previous position. In the spring of the following year, the V-8 was sent to Spain. Little is known about its combat service. Records indicate it was damaged in the summer of 1938, repaired, flew a few combat sorties in the autumn, and by year's end was brought back to Germany. In 1939, it was apparently written off. While rocket experiments with the He-112 were underway at Peenemünde, Ernst Heinkel continued refining the fighter's baseline design. Having been denied access to the 950 horsepower DB600 engines, he equipped the next prototype, the 9th, with a Junkers UMO 210E rated at 680 horsepower. This prototype was built according to the new layout akin to the V7, with short wings and a closed cockpit. In an effort to minimize drag and offset the reduced engine power, Heinkel fitted the aircraft with a retractable belly radiator, an unwise solution, abandoned by aircraft builders worldwide at the end of the 1930s due to poor reliability. The He-112 V9 carried exceptionally heavy armament for its time. 2 synchronized MG-17 machine guns with 500 rounds per gun, plus 2 20mm Oerlikon MG-FF cannons mounted in the wing panels, each with 60 rounds. By contrast, the production Messerschmitt Bf-109B was armed with only 2 machine guns. Beyond sheer firepower, the new Heinkel outperformed the Messerschmitt in speed by 40 kilometers per hour, climb rate, and service ceiling, all on the very same engine. The aircraft also offered excellent visibility and retained from earlier models its superior ground handling stability. However, the increased wing loading somewhat reduced maneuverability and worsened takeoff and landing performance. By its technical and tactical characteristics, the He-112B0 appeared much better suited than the early Messerschmitt variants for the interceptor role, precisely the role envisioned by the 1934 specification. But it arrived too late. The Bf-109 was already in serial production, and no one intended to disrupt an established production line for a new competitor. Moreover, as mentioned before, The Messerschmitt was cheaper, easier to build, simpler to maintain, more versatile, and its design held greater potential for further development. In April 1937, after completing a brief series of factory tests, the V-9 was dispatched to Spain to earn its combat reputation. Like the V-6 already deployed there, it was used as a ground attack aircraft. From May to July, under Hauptmann Harro Harder, the fighter flew 50 combat sorties, though it never once engaged in aerial combat. Several familiarization flights in the new aircraft were made by leading nationalist aces, Comandante Joaquin Garcia Morato and Captain Miguel Garcia Prado. Overall, they liked the plane, though Morato noted that the engine ought to have been more powerful. In August, the fighter returned to Germany, where its designer finally abandoned hopes that the He-112 would ever be adopted by the Luftwaffe. Yet export prospects still remained. Heinkel launched a vigorous promotional campaign. Photographs of the aircraft and laudatory articles filled the pages of German aviation journals. The fighter was demonstrated to military delegations from numerous countries, and pilots from Austria, Hungary, Spain, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Japan had the chance to fly it. In 1938, the He-112 V9 embarked on a publicity tour of smaller European nations interested in modernizing their fighter fleets. Potential customers were offered not only finished aircraft, but also licenses for production. The promotional efforts bore fruit. Interest in the fighter arose in Japan, which had already received the fifth prototype, as well as in Austria, Romania, Hungary, Finland, and of course Franco's Spain, ready, in order to continue its civil war, to purchase anything on offer. By the end of 1937, Japan had signed a contract for the delivery of 30 He-112s and a protocol of intent to purchase another 100 machines. In early 1938, the first 4 fighters in the He-112B0 variant entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy. They were designated the A-7 He-1 Naval Interceptor. Japanese pilots conducted comparative tests and several mock dogfights against the nation's standard naval fighter, the A-5M2. The Heinkel proved to be 65 kilometers per hour faster than its opponent, but in turning combat, it consistently lost. At that time, Japan adhered to a doctrine that emphasized close-range maneuvering combat, the kind of dogfights typical of World War I. As a result, Japanese pilots judged the German fighter rather coldly. Although the Heinkel was not designed for carrier operations, its liquid-cooled engine and what the Japanese considered an overly long landing roll also drew criticism. In the end, the order for 100 additional aircraft was canceled. The remaining 26 of the original contract were delivered by the end of 1938, though before that they briefly served with the Luftwaffe. The story is as follows. In the summer of 1938, during the so-called Sudeten Crisis, Germany declared its intent to annex the Sudetenland by force, bringing it to the brink of war with Czechoslovakia, as well as Britain and France, which supported it. Hitler, in claiming readiness to fight for the Sudetenland, was bluffing. The Reich's army and air force were not yet prepared for a major war with 3 European powers. Yet, these threats had to be backed by some display, and Germany mobilized all available aircraft that could be used in combat, including prototypes, pre-series aircraft, and machines built for foreign customers. Among these were the Heinkels destined for Japan, still sitting in Heinkel's warehouses. From them, a separate 4th group of the 132nd Air Regiment was formed. The fighters received military camouflage, national insignia, and tactical numbers. The unit was based at Oschatz near Leipzig, providing air defense for the city. In October, Hitler's dangerous gamble ended in full success. Representatives of France and Britain, eager to preserve peace at any cost, signed the Munich Agreement, handing over all disputed territories to Germany. Czechoslovakia's opinion was not even asked. Left alone, the Czechs dared not resist and submitted to the terms of what became known as the Munich Betrayal. On October 6, the first squadrons of German aircraft landed on the newly seized Czech airfields without a fight. The Heinkels were transferred to the Carlsbad Air Base, today Karlovy Vary. In November, with the threat of war temporarily lifted, the fighters were returned to their owner, and within a month they were shipped to Japan. All of the Heinkels received by the Japanese were used exclusively as trainers. A According to records, not a single aircraft ever saw combat. A few survived until the country's surrender in August 1945. In October that year, American occupation troops found one hidden among trees near Atsugi Airfield on Honshu. It was taken to the United States as a war trophy, but its subsequent fate remains unknown. The nationalists, Franco's supporters, purchased 19 Heinkels in two variants, the B-1 and B-2, differing in their engines. The B-1 carried the standard Jumo 210E, while the B-2 was powered by the Jumo 210G with direct fuel injection. The first two aircraft arrived in November 1938, the remainder in January 1939. They formed a new fighter group of two squadrons under Commander José Muñoz Jiménez. The unit was staffed by experienced pilots, many of whom had previously flown Fiat CR-32s and Heinkel HE-51s. The aircraft arrived disassembled and were reassembled by German mechanics. They retained their original light gray German paint scheme. For quick identification, the first squadron painted their propeller spinners and fin tips red, while the second used yellow. In addition, Francoist symbols, yoke and arrows, were painted on the fuselage over the national markings. The aircraft received tactical numbers ranging from 5 to 52 to 5 to 69. Conversion training for the Spanish pilots was swift and trouble-free, with former He-112 test pilots serving as instructors. On 17 January, the group relocated to León Airfield and began combat duty. At first, the Heinkels patrolled alongside Fiats along the front lines. By then, the outcome of the Civil War was already decided. Franco's forces launched a large-scale offensive in Catalonia, rapidly driving the Republicans to the French border, while nationalist air forces gained air superiority. The Republican Air Force was badly weakened, leaving few worthy opponents for the fighters with black roundels. Even so, on 19 January, the He-112 scored its first and only aerial victory in Spain, when Captain Garcia Prado shot down a Republican I-16. 2 days later, the Republicans evened the score, Lieutenant Luciano Tabernero Herrero flying an I-16 Type 10 Super Mosca down to Heinkel, the only combat loss of the type in the Spanish War. Afterward, Heinkel pilots encountered no more Republican aircraft. In early February, they were reassigned to other missions. The He-112s began flying reconnaissance and ground attack sorties against enemy troops and rail targets. Their 20mm cannons proved highly effective against locomotives and light armor. On 6 February, the Catalonia campaign ended. The remaining Republican forces retreated into France. On 21 February, Franco's supporters staged a grand military parade in Barcelona, with all branches of the armed forces participating. The highlight of the parade was a flyover by squadrons of Fiats and Heinkels, arranged in formation to spell out the letters FET, the abbreviation of Franco's official party. In early March, the fighter group was redeployed near Madrid. The Heinkels frequently appeared over the city, but no further aerial encounters occurred. On 28 March, during a routine patrol, the pilots received radio orders to return to base. The war was over. The Republican government had surrendered. Ironically, the first days of peace proved deadlier for Heinkel pilots than months of war. On 29 March, Lieutenant Rogelio Garcia de Juan, performing aerobatics at low altitude, lost control and crashed. Soon afterward, Captain Garcia Prado entered a flat spin during a training dogfight and was killed in the wreck of his aircraft. In the summer of 1939, the remaining Heinkels were consolidated into a single squadron, number 27, and sent to Morocco, Spain's colony in northwest Africa. In 1940, they received a three-color camouflage scheme and new national markings, red and yellow roundels on the wings. For the next 3 years, the Spanish pilots in Africa fought only the heat, sandstorms, and mechanical failures. But on the 8 November 1942, when Anglo-American forces launched Operation Torch, the landings in Algeria and French Morocco, the Spaniards had to recall their combat training. American aircraft repeatedly violated Spanish-Moroccan airspace, ignoring Spanish neutrality. Many times, Heinkels and Fiats scrambled to intercept, but their pilots only simulated attacks. The Spanish government, unwilling to escalate, had issued strict orders: do not open fire. On that day, an incident occurred that nearly provoked a war between the United States and Spain. A formation of 11 P-38 Lightnings once again violated the border, They were soon intercepted by a lone Heinkel, piloted by Lieutenant Miguel Entrena, who had scrambled on alert. It is unknown whether the lieutenant acted on his own initiative or had received a secret order from his superiors to teach the arrogant Yankees a lesson. But in any case, he slipped in behind one of the Lightnings and fired a burst from his cannon. The left engine of the twin-engine fighter caught fire. The other Americans, long accustomed to Spanish pilots never opening fire, were clearly caught off guard. It seems they did not even realize that only a single Heinkel had attacked them. The Lightnings hastily jettisoned their drop tanks and fled at full throttle across the border. The stricken fighter, trailing a long plume of black smoke, followed slowly after them. Entrena could have finished the enemy off, but instead he approached the American closely and, through cockpit gestures, urged him to bail out or make a forced landing. The Lightning pilot, however, proved stubborn. On his burning machine, losing altitude, he still managed to cross the border river Melilla and belly land on the Algerian side without lowering his landing gear. The jettisoned fuel tanks were recovered the same day by Spanish soldiers as proof that the fight had taken place over their territory. The Americans, however, cared little for such formalities. They burned with a desire for revenge. The next day, more than 20 Lightnings staged a deliberately provocative low-level flyover of Nador Airfield, where the Heinkels were based. Yet no battle followed. The Spanish pilots, having received strict orders from Madrid the previous day, sat it out on the ground. They were permitted to take off only if they were actually fired upon or bombed. The Americans did not dare escalate to that level. As a result, war was avoided and the incident was settled diplomatically. The Americans promised henceforth not to violate the airspace of Spain and its colonies. True, aircraft with white stars did occasionally appear over Morocco thereafter, but this was explained as pilot error and never led to shooting. Meanwhile, the Heinkels continued to suffer losses through accidents and crashes. Between 1941 and 1946, 3 aircraft were destroyed, killing 2 pilots. Several more had to be written off due to worn-out engines and a lack of spare parts. By the beginning of 1947, only 8 He-112s remained in service. The following year, the quote, Moroccan squadron was re-equipped with quote, new HS-132L biplanes, Fiat CR-32s built in Spain during the 1940s under Italian license, while the Heinkels were transferred to the flight school at Meran. In the summer of 1952, the last 2 aircraft were still flying there, but soon after they were retired and reduced to instructional airframes. The service of the He-112 in Hungary proved much shorter and far less remarkable. In June 1938, after a Hungarian delegation visited the Heinkel works, the Hungarian War Ministry declared its readiness to purchase 36 aircraft. These plans never materialized. In early 1939, only 4 machines arrived, one of which promptly crashed during a demonstration flight. The rest of the order was soon canceled, as the UMO-210 was judged outdated and insufficiently powerful for a fighter. Heinkel, meanwhile, was not allowed to sell aircraft equipped with Daimler-Benz engines. Nor did the idea of establishing licensed production in Hungary come to fruition. The 3 remaining Heinkels were incorporated into the Royal Hungarian Air Force, but they never saw combat and were used solely for training. By 1944, they had been written off due to failures in general wear. Austria's plan to acquire 42 He-112s fell away with the country's annexation into the Third Reich. The Heinkel fighters were also offered to Finland and the Netherlands, but the Finns chose the cheaper and simpler to maintain Fokker D-21, while the Dutch opted for their own designs, the Fokker and Koolhoven FK-58. The only country to actively employ the He-112 in World War II was Romania. The Royal Romanian Air Force purchased only 30 fighters, but they fought, as the saying goes, to the fullest. The sales agreement was signed in April 1939. During the summer, Romanian pilots arrived in groups of 10 at the Luftwaffe airfield in Regensburg, where they underwent retraining and then ferried the aircraft themselves to Bucharest. During training, one Heinkel was lost in a crash, but the Germans later compensated with a replacement. By early October, all the fighters had reached their destination. From them, the 5th Fighter Group was formed, consisting of the 51st and 52nd Squadrons. The group adopted Pluto, the popular cartoon dog of the time, as its emblem, though he was not painted on every aircraft. Soon after their arrival, the Romanians conducted comparative trials between the German fighter and their new domestic design, the IAR-80. The results were not favorable for the German. The Heinkel's underpowered engine proved to be its main flaw. The IAR-80, equipped with a 900 horsepower engine and a larger wing, achieved roughly the same top speed but surpassed its rival in maneuverability, climb rate, and service ceiling. It was also easier to fly. The He-112's only real advantage lay in its cannon armament, as the Romanian fighter carried only rifle-caliber machine guns. As a result of the trials, the Heinkels, just as in Spain, were reclassified as fighter bombers. In this role, they met the outbreak of war with the Soviet Union. At that moment, 28 serviceable He-112s remained in the Romanian Air Force. On that morning, the Heinkels, together with twin-engine Potez 63s of the 2nd Bomber Group, launched a surprise attack on the Soviet airfield at Bolgrad in southern Bessarabia. But the aircraft stands were empty. The command of the Odessa Military District Air Force had ordered its planes dispersed and camouflaged on forward strips the day before. The Romanians then diverted to a secondary target, the airfield of the 67th Fighter Regiment at Bulgarka. This time, the Soviet fighters met the attackers already in the air. A battle ensued. Lieutenant Theodore Moscu dived on an I-16, the last to take off and still with its landing gear down. His cannon burst set the Ishak ablaze, and it crashed into the trees at the edge of the airfield. Pulling out of his dive, Moscu spotted another I-16 coming head-on and fired fractions of a second before the Soviet pilot. The shell struck squarely into the broad nose of the red-starred fighter. Moscu saw several cylinders blown out of the Ishak's engine. The fighter, with its motor stopped, plunged steeply down. There was no time to watch further. A burst of machine gun fire ripped through the Heinkel's fuselage and right wing. Fuel poured from a punctured tank. Moscu was lucky the Soviet fighter that had slipped onto his tail lacked incendiary ammunition. By some miracle, he evaded another strike, broke off combat, and headed west, watching in dread as the fuel gauge needle dropped towards zero. Still, he managed to reach the nearest Romanian airfield. According to official records, Theodore Moscu scored the first 2 victories of the Romanian Air Force in World War II. The next day, the Heinkels again attacked Soviet airfields. Once more, they clashed with I-16s, but this time neither side prevailed. Soviet flak, however, brought down the He-112 of Adjutant Angel Kodret. The pilot bailed out and was captured. On 24 June, 2 Heinkels collided while taxiing. Both were so badly damaged they had to be written off. One of the aircraft, incidentally, was flown by the 5th Group's own commander, Major Gheorghe Miculescu. On 28 June, the Heinkel pilots were ordered to attack the fortress and port of Ismail, heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns. The Romanians had never encountered such intense flak. A direct hit shattered Lieutenant Constantin Smeu's aircraft. Another Heinkel was crippled by intercepting Soviet fighters. Second Lieutenant Constantin Stancu barely managed to cross the Prut River and Bellyland. On 2 July, the Romanians again attempted to strike Bulgarka airfield. This cost the lives of 2 more pilots. The fighters of Sergeant Olda Sirces and Adjutant Ion Igescu were shot down by anti-aircraft guns. Igescu's burning plane crashed onto the airfield itself, while Sirces managed to land his damaged machine but was shot dead by Red Army soldiers as he tried to escape. Soviet newspapers soon published photographs of the captured Heinkel. The next attack on Bulgarka came on 5 July. The Romanians claimed the destruction of 2 fighters, one on the ground and another attempting to take off under fire. That same day, however, Lieutenant Runescanu was killed in combat with an I-16. On 9 and 10 July, two more Heinkels were damaged in aerial combat. The pilots returned to base, but their aircraft were out of action for some time. On 12 July, the Romanians struck Soviet artillery batteries on the eastern bank of the Prut. During the raid, they engaged a patrol of Soviet fighters. Lieutenant Ion Zaharia managed to shoot one down. The Romanians, however, lost Lieutenant Ion Lascu, a former IAR test pilot who had volunteered for the front. It was his first and last combat sortie. A hit to his fuel tank caused his Heinkel to explode in midair. On 24 July, the depleted Romanian squadrons relocated to Comrat in newly seized Bessarabia. By then, only 14 Heinkels remained, exactly half their original strength. In a month of fighting, 7 aircraft had been shot down, 2 lost to accidents, and 5 were under repair. Due to these losses, the 52nd Squadron was disbanded, and its surviving aircraft were merged into the 51st. In September and early October, the Heinkels provided cover for the forces besieging Odessa. After the Soviet evacuation, they moved to the city's airfield. The 51st Squadron remained based in Odessa until the spring of 1942. By that time, it was deep in the rear of the German-Romanian forces, and little combat work remained. The pilots mostly flew maritime reconnaissance and patrols along the Black Sea coast from the Prut estuary to Ochakov. On one such flight, Sergeant Constantiescu went missing. His fate is still unknown. Most likely, he became lost and crashed into the sea. He was the last He-112 pilot to die in World War II. In July, the 51st Squadron, by then with only 9 serviceable Heinkels, was reinforced with Hurricanes and withdrawn to Romania. It was redesignated as a night fighter squadron. Until the end of the year, the He-112s made several unsuccessful attempts to intercept Soviet bombers raiding Constanța, Bucharest, and Ploiesti. In early 1943, the squadron was re-equipped with Bf-110s, better suited to the night fighter role. Thus ended the combat service of the He-112. Surviving aircraft were relegated to training duties. The last was retired in 1947.
The frontline assessment of the He-112 by Romanian pilots was not high, but this was due in part to the way they were used. Aircraft lacking armor and self-sealing fuel tanks were thrown against ground targets, suffering heavy losses. The vulnerability of liquid-cooled engines and wing-mounted fuel tanks further worsened survivability. In air combat, the Heinkels fought the Soviet fighters more or less evenly, but it must be remembered that their opponents were only obsolete I-16s. In conclusion, the Heinkel 112 was by no means the worst combat aircraft of its era, yet the choice of the Messerschmitt as the Luftwaffe's main fighter must be recognized as correct. The Heinkel played only a minor role, destined always to remain in the shadow of its more successful and fortunate rival.